put in some new works by women. This is a piece by Ruth Short called Orifice. And I haven't found out a lot about her, but she is Irish, and she graduated from the School of Design in Ireland, but now she's based in Brooklyn, New York. She's been involved with Urban Glass, the Glass Center in Brooklyn. She's done some workshops there. And this piece reflects her interest in the body, and she's interested in the relationships of the body to its environment. And so the title Orifice evokes that, and the forms also evoke that, because they are these bulbous round forms that kind of relate to nature and could evoke any number of natural forms like cells or berries or just microscopic structures. And then they have these very strange openings on them that really look like mouths. And then the glass is gilded inside, but you can't really see all of the inside of the spaces, so that it makes it very mysterious, and you kind of don't know if there's something inside or what's inside. So it's a very abstract work that's kind of talking about the body. It happens to be in the collection of the modern and contemporary art department of the museum in terms of curatorially, just because it came from a donor into that curatorial department. And that really speaks just to the fact that some of the divisions between craft and design and contemporary art in general are really kind of arbitrary, and sometimes things fit into one category or another through other factors besides the characteristics of the work itself that have to do with curatorial relationships with donors and other kinds of external factors. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this is more sculpture than something else in this gallery, because something else in the gallery is craft and design and this is contemporary art. There's not that much of a difference between the two. But at any rate, so that's that.
Are the objects fixed, or do they get placed differently depending on the display?
They are not attached to the steel. When they're in storage, they're loose. They're separate objects. As far as how they're arranged, I'm not sure if that's a specific thing or if it's more just kind of they're scattered around and distributed. I'd have to ask our art handlers and registrars how that works, so maybe I can find out about that.
Does she do the crafting of the steel? Or does she just...
Steel. I'm not sure about that either. I do know that just looking online, she does have an email address, so maybe we will try to contact her and find out a little bit more about the piece. And then another new piece in the gallery is this piece by Stacy Neff, which also is in the modern and contemporary art department. Stacy Neff, she lives in New Mexico. She is in Santa Fe. She has a degree in studying glass from Rhode Island School of Design, and has also studied at Pilchuck Glass School, which you may have heard of, which was founded by Dale Chihuly. It's in Seattle, or actually in Washington State. And it's a major place for learning about glass technique. And she's based in Santa Fe. She runs a studio called the New Mexico Experimental Glass Workshop, which allows contemporary artists who don't have training in glass to come in and work with that medium and take advantage of the technical expertise of Stacy and her colleagues there. In terms of her own work, she's also very interested in the body and in natural forms. She has these three related series, one called Microcosmos, the other called Biomythology, and another one called Geotime. And this piece comes from the series called Geotime, where she was interested in different ways of measuring time, different scales of time. She talks about hummingbird time, volcano time, music time, just different approaches to time. She also often talks about her pieces resembling botanical structures and biological structures. Spores, she talks about a lot, and you can kind of see a little bit of a reference to spores with this piece. So it's in a similar way to the Ruth Short, it's kind of an abstracted reference to nature. It's called Red Slang, and I'm not sure about the meaning of the title, but there's this piece and then there's another Red Slang piece that's similar that's also in our collection. It's not on view. And it's glass with fiberglass and resin, and she often combines glass with those other materials, or sometimes with metal as well. So she's really interested in kind of pushing the characteristics of glass beyond what you normally expect of the medium. So she makes beadwork that is sometimes jewelry and sometimes sculpture, and she also collaborates with glassmakers in Murano, Italy, to make larger glass pieces for her work. This piece is called Spring, And I can't tell you the specific meaning of the piece, but a lot of her work deals with social issues, has to do with racial relations, gender, and class struggles. So she lives in Baltimore. She's African American, but she has ancestry from Native American as well as Scottish ancestry as well. And so she comes from a long line of makers. Her mother is Elizabeth Scott, who's a well-known quilt artist, and she also has people in her family who have done basket making, worked with metal, worked with clay and wood. So her earliest training was at home with her mother and with her relatives, learning how to make things. So she's drawing on those issues in this work as well. So this figure here, because it's got these kind of silvery beads on it, it seems that, based on what I know of her other works, it's probably meant to be a white person. And then if you look at the face, there's a fabric face that's a female face. It's also a Caucasian person. And then there's this other creature that's on her shoulder that's colored blue and green. And since the title is Spring, I'm thinking that's a reference to planet Earth. That's like the colors of planet Earth. And then they're attached glass elements, and then she's done beadwork on it. And the wooden chair is an African carved wooden piece. So she's combined some interesting components there with the glass and the beads. Beyond that, I can't say exactly what the piece means, but we do have lots of information in our files about her. So if you want more information about her, we can certainly get it for you. And that's the final piece is the Applet by Ingeborg Lundin, designed for the Orrefors Glass Company of Sweden. And it's just a really beautiful example of a design piece that was made in multiples. But they're kind of rare to find nowadays because they're from the 50s and many of them have broken over the years, so it's wonderful for us to have a perfectly intact apple. These are also somewhat difficult to make, this perfectly round form without any impurities in the glass. And if you look really closely, you'll notice that the stem had been added on later. There's kind of like, you can see a seam around the stem where you can tell that they made the glass orb and then they made the stem and they attached the two of them together. So that process of attaching them would have also been very technically difficult. And so she would have designed this piece and then worked with the glass makers at the Orrefors Glass Company to achieve that beautiful sculptural piece.
I'm sorry, would you say the designer again, please?
Ingeborg Lundin. Thank you. So Judith Schechter has a degree from Rhode Island School of Design, and she went there to study painting, but then she got really intrigued by what the glass makers were doing. And so she actually changed her major and focused on glass. She got really interested in combining those two aspects of herself, and she was drawn to stained glass, and that's what she specializes in. So you can really see her painterly sensibilities there. It's very pictorial. It's different from the rest of the works in the gallery. And she's really interested in medieval and sort of Gothic representations of the human figure. She often uses these female figures that are somewhat cartoonish. They always have very large eyes and sort of oversized heads. And her imagery is very sort of like Gothic and deals with sort of gory things. This piece is called hemophilia. It's a reference to that blood condition where the blood doesn't clot and people are very vulnerable to injury. She was inspired by reading a biography of the Russian royal family. Some of you have probably heard of how their son had hemophilia, and that was passed down throughout the European royalty. It was generally passed down so that the women are usually carriers but don't have the symptoms, and then it's the men who have the symptoms. And because of everybody intermarrying throughout the European royalty and Russia, there were quite a few different royals and nobles that had that disease. It's genetically transmitted, and it's rare in the population in general, but it was much more common among the royalty. So she was thinking about that, and so you see that the figure has these sort of like veins sort of emanating from her hands and going up to the top sort of cartouche there, that oval piece that has a hand checking the pulse of another person. And so it's talking about that kind of vulnerability that happens with that disease.
Rebecca, I just think that in her work it's really interesting that she uses so many layers of glass and paints each of them differently. And
Yes.
I just want to add that to the scene.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's very complex.
It is quite intricate and meticulous, and that process is important for her. She likes the she likes that complexity of the process because the time it takes to do all of that helps her focus on her ideas and helps her evolve her ideas instead of just doing something like quickly. It just, the nature of the process is very intrinsic to her thinking about pieces as well. And the pieces are generally displayed on light boxes like this so that you can have them illuminated the way that a stained glass window would be with the natural light.
I mean, it's smooth textured, geometric versus this very organic, roughly textured piece. So it's a nice conversation to have in front of these two. And we've got more context in the outline. People always ask about the bubbles. How do you get the bubbles in there? And as a result of, again, they're using chunk glass. This is not poured molten glass like a Bertil Berlin uses. This is chunks of glass. And when those chunks of glass meet, sometimes it traps air in the melting phase. And these artists know it happens. And being savvy artists, they know how to some degree, control how big those bubbles are and how many develop inside the glass. And you'll see evidence of that in both these pieces.
Is the color available when they put the chunks in, or once they heat it, do they add the color?
I think the color is already in there in the chunks
Okay,
when they heat it up.
that way it's so permanent and so consistently
Yeah.
homogeneous throughout the whole thing.
And there's post-production things done, especially with Ivan Marish's piece. He does a lot of grinding and polishing. And you'll see there's rough surfaces, but there's also a lot of smoother surfaces in sort of the rear of the piece. So he does a lot of post-production, polishing, grinding of the piece to make it contrast.
I know their husband and wife couple. I can't remember. One of them designs and one of them implements. I can't remember which it was.
Yeah, the wife, Briktova, whatever.
Let's all, can we work on this name?
Yeah. Yeah, let's work on the name. Say that. Yeah.
I mean, I don't speak Czech, so I'm
Yeah,
just
I don't.
anglicizing all these names, but I think it's pretty accepted that it's Yaroslava
Okay.
Richtova
Okay.
and Stanislav Lubensky.
Okay, so then which
Yeah,
one's the
yeah.
designer?
This is the same as this.
The wife is the designer.
Okay.
So here's what happens. So Stanislav Lubensky, the husband, draws this imagery. So he'll do these large sketches of these geometric shapes. The wife, Miss Briktova, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I'll learn it. I'll learn it eventually. She then takes those sketches and conceives a clay mold based on those sketches. And then a plaster mold is produced from that clay version. And then that's where the glass is put in. So it's definitely true
studio,
collaboration.
actually. The studio is the glass makers actually take their designs and fabricate them.
Yes. Yeah, so these are not like mass commercial.
Neither of them is like the glass maker.
Right, they're
They're the
overseeing
designers
the process.
Yes,
They're
yes,
not
so-
the literally person
Yeah.
making it.
Right. So there's a team of people that they work with. Just like the Berlin.
Also because they're fairly elderly, right?
He's dead. She's very helpful. And Maresh was one of their students.
Yes. Yeah. So all these artists. So Lubensky and Briktova were sort of the teachers, and all these other artists featured in here have some connection to them, whether they're former students or they've learned from these Czech artists.
One of only 2 architectural-sized commissions that Lubensky and Briktova did in the United States. The other's at Corning Museum of Glass in New York, and it's their last commission together before Lubensky passed away. It was originally made for the previous location of the Craft and Design Museum that was the old Montaldo's building, which is now the foundation for the Carolinas. And it was moved here, and in both places it required reinforcement of the floor and ceiling with steel beams because it weighs 6,600 pounds. It's made of, let's see, is it 10 panels or 8 panels? 10 panels of a concave and a convex lens, so to speak, that allows you to look through it and see the collection, and it's called Relations because of the way it draws relationships between the works in the collection and itself. And then the Year of the Woman, we wanted to highlight women woodturners, which are somewhat rare in the field. It's mostly a male-dominated field, although that has been changing, especially in the last 20 years. So there are some works by some important women artists. I know that you all wanted to focus on and talk especially about Maria Van Pesteren and Meryl Salin.
Too. Yeah.
Yes, so there's 2 works by Maria Van Pesteren in the gallery. There's this one, and then on the opposite side, there's a little black box on a shelf. Maria Van Pesteren is Dutch, and she is one of the earliest female woodturners to emerge in the movement, really kind of getting her start in the 1970s. She's very interested in geometry, and most of her work that she makes is circular. She's very interested in the circle, its perfect roundness, and she likes to create just endless variations on the circle. She's less interested in wood as a medium than some other woodturners. For her, the characteristics of wood aren't that important. It's more of a means to an end. It's just a material that makes her able to make the sculpture she wants. So she has no qualms about painting the wood or bleaching it. She doesn't care about showing you the grain of the wood. She prefers to work with woods that have very little grain and little color. So she works with ash, lime wood, and elm, and both of the pieces in the gallery are elm wood. These are also woods that are indigenous to the Netherlands, which is convenient for her. And if you have ever seen other Dutch minimalism, because there's a kind of a thread of minimalism that runs through a lot of Dutch contemporary art, her work is very much in keeping with that. It has that very minimalistic, geometric focus on clean, pure forms. She has talked about how she likes these logical, clean forms, and she likes to remove anything that interferes with that purity that she's trying to achieve. And you can really see that in this piece as well as the other one in the gallery. And then as an interesting contrast to that, we placed it nearby the Meryl Salin piece. Meryl Salin is an American woodturner. She lives in California. She got her training in art, and I think it was at UCLA. Anyway, she went to school in California and got a BA in design. She actually went back to school after becoming a wife and mother and had 3 kids when she went back to get her BA in the 70s. And then she started turning wood in order to pay her studio rent and have some things that she could sell. And she had been thinking about going on for a master's in architecture, but she got so interested in wood that she decided to focus on that and became another one of the earliest female wood turners. She also likes geometric forms, but she's interested in things like the texture of wood and color and the contrast between those things. So in this piece, she innovated in that she created a wood piece, but she also created a cast resin segment to this jelly donut, which she juxtaposed with the wood. So that's more typical of her work, the inclusion of the other things that are colorful in addition to the wood. So it shares some of the geometry of the Maria van Pesteren, but then it also, her philosophy and the way that she thinks about wood is quite different. And there's a little bit of humor because of the title of Jelly Donut, and it really does kind of evoke a jelly donut with its coloring and its shape and so forth.
So does polyester and resin mean the same thing?
Yeah, well, in this case, I mean, it is polyester resin.
Oh, okay.
It's a form of resin that's made from polyester. We have another new piece by this artist. His name is Mark Sfiri. That's S-F-I-R-R-I. And he's really known for his multi-axis wood turning, where when he mounts the piece to the lathe, he'll turn it to a certain extent and then reorient its axis on the lathe to create a different angle. And you can really see that just gloriously on display here with the very complex sconce sort of forms that he has there, and then the legs of the piece and the other details of the mirrored piece. And so he, of course, makes furniture as well as smaller turned wood objects, which is what the other piece in the gallery is that's by him. So here's a little case showcasing some of the new acquisitions as well as some other older acquisitions. You may know that much of our wood collection comes from the collectors Jane and Arthur Mason, who live in the Washington, D.C. area and have been collecting turn wood since the 70s and have made friends with a lot of these artists, and they're just really the consummate collectors. So we have pieces that came into our collection earlier and that were featured in the exhibition in 2003 called Turning Wood into Art, which has a great catalog, very useful essays, and I definitely recommend you read that to learn about the history of turn wood and about these artists. So we have Mike Schuler, Hans Joachim Weisblog, and J. Paul Fenelware, who all make very small works. Weisblog is trained as an engineer, and he's really known for these ball-shaped boxes. That's actually a box with a lid, and just very intricate, very precise work. And Mike Schuler is an example of someone taking some unusual materials and seeing what he could do on the lathe with them. So these are all pine cones that he has turned, which certainly must be challenging because those are very irregular. They don't even, I don't know if they could be said to have a grain or not, but whatever the sort of grain or pattern they have, you have to work with that on the lathe, and then the result is quite spectacular, as you see. And then we have these recent acquisitions that are also small in scale. We have a piece by Bin Fo. So if you're missing Realm of Dream, at least you have another Bin Fo to talk about, called Winter Night, and it has a beautiful painting of a kimono with cypress branches, and then this lovely sort of jewelry-like element that goes through it. And you can certainly see his very intricate cuttings and carvings there, which is what he's known for, the way that he uses wood. He's less interested in the grain of the wood and using it as sort of a canvas for his very sort of dreamlike imagery.
Rebecca, do you think he tries to make them so very thin so that it almost looks like it couldn't be wood?
You know, that might be, yeah.
Because they're, what, 1/16 of an inch or something like that. Just very
Right.
finely
I think,
done.
I mean, every artist has their ways of pushing something to the limit, and that's his way of pushing wood to the limits of fragility, and just the incredible intricacy and precision is something that he obviously values very much. Leah Dotson, another female wood turner. She lives in Arizona and is really inspired by the desert, so she likes to capture sort of like the waves of the sand dunes and those textures. She's known for these very intricate laminated pieces, so you see that there's many different sort of like ribbons of color in it. And that's just thin layers of wood that she's laminated together and glued together so that she then turns that block of laminated wood, and she has to know how to do that to create the patterns that she achieves in these funnel-like forms that she's very known for. So she's pushing the limits of wood in that way. Instead of turning a single piece of wood, she's turning all these layers of very thin layers of wood.
Is that put together kind of like plywood?
Yeah. And then Haley Smith is a Welsh artist who's also a noted wood turner. She does a lot of texturing with Dremel tools, so you'll see that on her lathe turn carved and scorched piece right here, kind of spherical bowl. You see all those little round textural marks there. And then Gary Knox Bennett, you might know that name because of his Aaron's belly button clock in the furniture gallery. He's much more known as a furniture artist, but for a specific gallery show in the early 2000s, he did a project where he gathered discarded turned wood materials from various turned wood artists, and then he responded to them and did things with them. And you can really see kind of the same irreverence that you notice in his furniture, the way that he's approached these objects. He's not interested in the wood grain and really the beauty of wood. He's just more interested in these as materials that he can respond to. So he's got this kind of unusual bowl form that's probably painted because it's so yellow inside, and then it's got these springs attaching it, sort of denying its function as a bowl and making it into a sculptural piece. And so that's another recent gift from Jane and Arthur Mason. And then over here is where we have Maria Van Kesteren's lidded vessel, again, kind of that donut, cylindrical, circular form. And you can see the seam of the lid in the box there. And then this is Madonna and Child by Mark Spheri. So now that title makes sense, right?
Yes.
They're kind of like abstracted figures. And they're also with that multi-axis turning, because if they had just been one axis, they would just look exactly like bowling pins, but instead, he's rotated the axis so that they're like heads turning towards each other in this very kind of like intimate kind of relationship between the two. This piece is also by a female wood turner named Catherine Siegel, and it's not from Jane and Arthur Mason. It's actually something that we purchased from the Piedmont Craft exhibitions that were held in North Carolina in the 70s and 80s. So it's a kind of early work by her. I didn't know a lot about her until I started researching her for this training session, and it turns out shortly after this, in the early 1980s, she moved on to focusing on furniture and sculpture. And so now she makes commissions as well as just artistic pieces that are very whimsical, usually painted, kind of postmodern styles, very different from this piece. But this piece is laminated wood. You can see the different kind of layers of it, and it's laminated and turned and then carved to kind of look like wormwood. But that's not naturally what the wood is at all. It's carved to look like that.
Does she live locally?
No, she, let's see, so she lived in Florida for a number of years, and then in the late 90s she moved to Philadelphia, and that's where she lives now. And then we also have these other recent acquisitions from Jane and Arthur Mason. Mark and Mel Lindquist both have works in our collection that you may already know. Mel Lindquist is one of the early wood turners who discovered it as a hobby. He was working in engineering, and he set up his own wood shop in his garage in the 1950s and started turning wood. And he became very interested in unusual woods that are difficult to turn, like burl wood, which is created when the tree has a disease that makes the wood all gnarly inside and its grain is like all these weird circular sort of nubs. And so Mel Lindquist is really known for his expertise at turning that type of wood. His son, Mark Lindquist, carried on the family tradition of wood turning, but kind of took it in a different direction. He has influences from studying art at school, has an MFA and a BFA, and he also studied pottery with a Japanese potter, so he's interested in Zen and Japanese philosophies, and something that's called wabi-sabi, which is kind of the beauty of like roughness and natural asymmetry and things like that. And so that's part of his work. And the two of them worked on this piece together. It was fairly early in Mark's career, but when Mel was well established. So it's kind of a nice father and son collaboration. We don't have anything else by both of them in the collection, although we have several works by each of them separately in the collection.
No, this doesn't make any sense. Untitled, so 1979 to 1930.
Yeah, that's a typo. It's supposed to be 1979 to 81. We're going to change it.
Thank you. Okay.
And then Rod Cronkite, he's based in Wisconsin, and this is Nepal trekking. He's also interested in burl wood, and that's what this is, maple burl. And I would surmise that the title has to do with the natural formation of the wood that kind of looks like a mountain range on top of here. But with that formation being there, this must have been very difficult to turn as well. And he's achieved a very thin wall, which you can kind of see when you look into the hole that's in it, naturally occurring hole that's there. And so this would have required great skill as well to put sort of like hollow out the inside of it to create that thin wall out of this burl wood. So he's local. He emigrated from the Ukraine, but he's now an American citizen. And this came to us through Hodges Taylor Gallery that represents him. And we don't really know the story behind this piece, but we're trying to get in touch with him. But it is interesting for its large scale, just this incredible sort of like human-sized piece of wood that he's managed to turn on a lathe. And then he's created these sort of like splints where you see some cracks and you see the knot in the wood, and then he's created these beautiful splints that are reminiscent of something Japanese that you see with ceramics often, where they repair ceramic cracks with like gold leaf. This is almost analogous to that. He hasn't disguised the repairs. He's made them a focal point. He's made them a design element that just adds interest to the piece, and contrast of those geometric lines with the organic grain of wood. Also, in that corner, there's a piece by Robin Horn, and she is very much, her focus, her specialty is carving with the chainsaw. So it's hard to imagine the chainsaw being an artistic tool, but she has used it as such. And so she does abstract forms that are carved that way. And then, of course, there's the Susan Point, which is unlike everything else in the gallery or anything else in the wood collection. I don't know, do I talk about that now or just tomorrow when we do?
And for our new docent candidates, we're going to talk about works like this tomorrow.
That's what he later did. He started working with plate glass, and his response to the characteristics of glass was like, what does it do? Let's exaggerate that. It fractures, it breaks, so let's break it. So he breaks the glass and gets all these uneven edges, which is how just the way that glass fractures, the structure of glass is such that it creates these uneven edges, and he decided to take advantage of that and made it into a chair, combining it with metal, and then the tips of the metal are heel tips that are used on Jimmy Choo's shoes. Fun fact. So this work, this type of work really caused a stir in the early 1980s when artists were really challenging design. They were not looking at form follows function. They were not thinking along those lines at all. And they were taking that legacy and turning it on its head and saying, let's make design expressive. Let's not worry so much how functional it is. If it's a chair that's uncomfortable to sit on, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's a beautiful chair and makes an important statement. So that's really what's happening with this chair. I can't imagine sitting on this chair. You'd probably slip off of it But it's just a beautiful sculptural piece.
It wasn't really meant to have utility, it was more
Right.
like a sculpture.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely a piece that if it were in your house, it wouldn't be the chair that everyone runs to sit in, but it would be a chair that they definitely look at and notice and
What is the legs made of?
metal.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Is that
It
from
says steel.
Steel.
I don't know what mild steel means, but flint glass and mild steel. I don't know what that means.
Well, mild steel is just one of the variations of types of alloys of steel. And then it's been patinaed or aged with iron, or it's kind of like rusted on purpose. So I know Joel wanted to focus on this piece and talk about this because it's so different from any other clay pieces that you've ever seen or anything else in the gallery. So this is a piece by Michael Lucero, who so he trained in California. He studied Humboldt, California, I think it is. And then he got his master's degree at UC Berkeley. Or no, sorry, Washington State, University of Washington, rather. University of Washington. Okay, so anyway, so he got his degree in the late 1970s and then immediately moved to New York, but he did not take his pottery equipment with him. He was more interested in doing sculptural work. So when he was in New York, he made this early series called the Shards series. And so what he did is he made slabs of pottery that he fired and then broke into shards, and then he drilled holes in them and strung them together with telephone wire and sometimes used metal armatures as well. And then the only actual piece of vessel-like pottery would be the head. So they're like stylized figural pieces where the only thing that has volume is the head, and that's a metaphor for the head as a vessel of consciousness. And these pieces got him a lot of acclaim and notice in the contemporary art world at large for the way that he was working with clay. So he really was revolutionizing what you could do with clay. Nobody had ever seen somebody make a piece out of shards like this before. It's so different from the emphasis on the vessel or even just the sculptural clay that other people were making at the time. So they're just all very abstracted. He only did this for a few years in the 1980s, and then he moved on to other series, and we have works by him also in the collection of these other series.
I think he's fascinating because I think every phase he goes through is so different from
It's
the
true.
one he was in previously.
He does change a lot.
Where does the Pixie one come in respect, like in the series of history?
That's much later. So after this, he did a series called The Dreamers, which are like these large heads that are inspired by Brancusi's abstracted heads, but instead of leaving them unadorned, he painted scenery that reflects dreamlike landscapes on them. So that was what he was doing in the early 1980s. Then in the late 80s, he moved away from clay and did metal sculpture for a while. In 1990, he went back to clay and he kind of moved off of the Dreamers series and made other pieces that were not heads, but rather animals and insects. And so we have the big frog piece that you may know that's also with this fantastical landscape imagery. All of that very influenced by his upbringing. He grew up in New Mexico, and so the desert and the ancient architecture of the Pueblo and all of that was very interesting to him. And he also responds to lots of other different cultures like art of the ancient Americas, the Peruvian and the Aztec and all of those cultures as well. So he went then beyond that and he did some other series and then eventually ended up with the Proud Pixie that's from 2004, where he really is just moving outside of the usual use of clay because it's clay but then it has string glued onto it in patterns. I don't think that there's a lot of relationship between this piece and Proud Pixie because it's a lot in between the two.
Yeah, no, but you were saying using clay in different
ways.
And so since you don't see the clay in that piece, you know.
That's
kind of
true,
what
yes.
Struck me.
Right, yeah, his attitude towards clay is much more irreverent and more like a means to an end and more of definitely thinking in a sculptural way. He thinks of himself as a sculptor, not so much as a potter, like not a person that like throws vessels that you drink tea out of or something. Stephen DeStabler actually studied at Black Mountain College, which is a very influential school that only existed from 1933 to 1951 out in Black Mountain, west of here. And it's important because it made the arts very much an integral part of the curriculum. So if you were majoring in art or not, you'd end up taking art classes. The art program was led by Josef Albers, who emigrated and was trained at the Bauhaus, and then his wife Annie Albers was also there. And lots of famous people taught there or studied there. So Stephen DeSabler studied there in 1951, right before they closed, and he was there at the same time as Robert Motherwell and Ben Shahn, who were important modernist painters and printmakers and illustrators. So he's very much part of that modernist art context. And I think probably because the school closed due to lack of funds, that was probably why he moved on to Princeton, where he got his BA in 1954, and he majored in religious studies. So you start to, so religious studies, that comes to influence his later sculptural work. He then went and did his master's in California. And so the way he works with clay, it's sculptural. These are solid masses of clay. He does a lot of these figural pieces that are abstracted figures. You have the seated woman here and the standing man there. You can see some general references to body parts there. So he does these figures in a way that they look like they're either crumbling or emerging from the material. And there's this very sort of archaic, kind of primordial, primal, ancient, archaeological feel to them. And then that kind of comes through with his study of ancient religions as well, and kind of the interest in archaeology and ancient cultures. There's some references to bones in here in the midst of the clay as well that makes them look like archaeological remnants. And the colors on them are all from stains that are rubbed into the clay, or mixed into the clay rather, so that the color and the form are integral to each other. It's not a surface application of color, but it's part of the form, which is part of this sort of geological sense that the pieces have. And if you look at the sides of them, and it looks like sort of like the layers, geological layers of rock, so sediment and sandstone, kind of like ancient rocks like that. So he's really interested in that aspect of the materiality of clay, the fact that clay comes from the earth, it essentially is dirt in a way, and rock. Dirt and rock is basically what clay is, so he's really responding to that and using the clay to his advantage to achieve that kind of reference in his work. Earthy-looking new North Carolina pieces, such as Eric Kanaka's chain piece. His name does not look like how it's pronounced at all, Eric Kanaka. So he's done a series of these chain pieces. Did any of you go to PMI and see his pieces in his booth that were like this?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so he's done these in series. And he's also interested in ancient cultures and kind of like the primal qualities of clay. And the way that he does these chains, they're all linked together and fired in the kiln, and that requires a lot of expertise to make them not fuse together and not break when they're being fired. So it's a beautiful sculptural piece, but also requires a lot of technical skill as well. Let's see if I got anything about that piece. Okay, so he studied at the University of Minnesota and then came and settled here and has a studio in Asheville. Oh, and he also studied sculpture and pottery in Thailand, so that's an influence of his as well. And he majored in art, anthropology, and English. So you can see the interest in anthropology in his work as well. Heads are, much like what I've been saying about Stephen DeSabler and Eric Kanaka, very interested in like these ancient looking pieces that are very artifact-like. And it's kind of like a skull, but not exactly. It's a very abstracted skull. And when you look at it from different angles, you see different things because it's somewhat human, but it's also somewhat almost like an ancient ancestor of humans, like a sort of like a primate that's not quite human yet. And you look at one side, like if you look on the side, it looks more like a human skull. You can see the cranium, you can see the way that the bones relate to the human skull. But then you look at this side and you see this like really exaggerated brow bone, and it looks much more like a chimpanzee. And then you see just the way that the face is, and there's like sort of these teeth here, and then there's an ear though. Well, I guess chimpanzees have these big ears as well, like this. So it's got a lot of different references that are in it. It's slab built, and you look at it, you can see the different slabs, some of which are more rectangular, and other ones more abstract. So it's an additive process as well as a process of taking clay away and manipulating the slabs. Also, it's obviously very heavy, so that requires some technical skill to fire something that heavy in the kiln. Well, when something is crude, you have to think a little further and say, is it really, does it look the same as something that you could throw together, or is it more controlled? What does it take to achieve the particular look that it has? And if you really think about it, there is a lot of control and a lot of decision making that has to happen to make it look a certain way. Because if you've ever been to the Salvation Army and seen somebody's pottery that they made in a class and then ended up at the Salvation Army, there's a big difference between poorly made pottery and seemingly crude pottery by an accomplished artist. And that's sometimes hard to see if you're not making that comparison, but I mean, once you look at something, like anything I could make would not hold a candle to this. Like, I'm not a potter. If I took a pottery class at Playworks and I tried to make a sculpture, I could not achieve something like this.
It's almost an intentionality to have
Yes.
that kind of
Yeah.
rough form, and also the three faces that you sort of get. All of that has.
Right. And so Dottie and Annie went to New York recently and picked out these 2 pieces. Both of them are porcelain and both the same type of glaze, but very different approaches. The piece is by Kato Subusa, and it's called Triangular Heart. So it's this sort of triangular or pyramidal piece that is inspired by blades and fire, flames, and mountain crags, and it really evokes all of those things. It's hand carved and hand shaped, and it has a lot of really irregular parts to it that are just very organic. And it uses a glaze called Seihakuji, which is this blue glaze, and it has a lot of interesting variations as well. The way that there's this surface of glaze which has cracked in the kiln, and then it drips and it pools, and it's got these just beautiful clear pools. It's a vitreous glaze, which means it's basically glass. It's just like a layer of glassy substance on the piece. Kato is from a long history of pottery making in Japan. His family had made pottery going back into the 1500s. He also trained at a couple of art schools and worked in a production pottery before setting up his own shop. He's now very well known around the world and has exhibited around the world. And he's really known for this type of very craggy form. When Annie and Dottie saw it in the gallery, it reminded Dottie of when she and Mal traveled to the Alps. And you can really see that type of look in the way that it's formed. Also porcelain with the same glaze by another very renowned Japanese artist, Fukami Suharu. And he also comes from a long line of potters. And his piece is called Ku, K-U-U, which is the Japanese word for both heaven and air. And this form has this very transcendent quality to it. He works in a specific way that allows him to achieve these forms. He makes the molds by hand, clay molds, and then he uses those to create molds that are injection molded with liquid clay that is injected into them at high pressure, which then allows it to form into these very precise shapes where there's no evidence of the hand. And he too is inspired by blades like samurai swords and the crests of waves, things like that. Very much the same influences as Kato, but a very different response to them. Very precise. And everything about it is planned in advance so that even the variations in the thickness of the glaze throughout the piece has all been accounted for and planned. And it's that same type of Seihakuji glaze. And he often positions his works on these wooden bases that allow them to look very precarious, like they're soaring into the air, which is very much related to the title of the piece and really captures that feeling of air.